Hello and welcome to Mooks and Monsters. I'm Tim Niederreiter, and I'm alone today on this podcast because various issues with the holidays. It's a busy time for everybody, but I'm the one with the editing job, and so I'm the one here. So, even though we don't always line up our pasts with our gaming, and it's not necessarily that important. I want to say, I mean, if you're just getting into gaming as an adult, or you've never gamed before, you can still become a great game master, a good game master, whatever. You can play these games, you can have a lot of fun. That's the most important part, of course. But I think, like a lot of people in this hobby, I have been in it most of my life. I started out with playing war games as a very small child, or at least being very interested in war games. I don't know when I actually started playing them. If that was before or after the role-playing games. You know, collecting Warhammer 40,000 miniatures. Which I still collect 40k miniatures, even though I really shouldn't. And, that's Warhammer 40,000. 40k, the year 40,000. So anyway, and I played Magic the Gathering for many years. And, so like any child who was I was born in the 90s, very beginning of the 90s, so I grew up then, and Magic was huge when I was a kid, and it really is a very good game for learning both math and some logic skills, as well as vocabulary. Seriously, that's a great game, but that's not really what I'm talking about today. This is all just kind of a prelude to when I discovered when I got into role-playing games, because, of course, that's what this show is about. And how I ran my first role-playing game, which I think I've mentioned before on this show. It was Dungeons & Dragons. I think it was a basic set. I don't think it was OD&D, but it was probably 2nd edition OD&D or something like that. And I ran that shortly after I got into the game. And it was this little dungeon, little adventure where the characters had to explore this Ankheg's nest, and there was a talking door, and there were some troglodytes, I believe, that they ended up enlisting to help them. They swayed them to help fight the Ankheg. No, it wasn't an Ankheg. It was an Ettercap. That's right. Ankhegs aren't even intelligent. What am I talking about? At least in most editions of the game. I mean, obviously they're a fictional creature. They could be anything, but in this case, it was an Ettercap. And they eventually chased the Ettercap away that way. So, yeah, so that game was more inspired by Xanth books, I think, if I recall, the Piers Anthony Xanth books, which I was kind of into as a kid. I read a lot of those as a kid. So, yeah, so I started playing D&D because of a game that my brother got involved, and one of my friends got involved with on the playground on this, because we were in kindergarten, which meant at our school we had to stay on the sidewalk during recess. We weren't allowed to go off into the playground. We had to stay on the sidewalk because, they could keep a better eye on us and stuff. So there was a long sidewalk that went along the playgrounds on one side, and that's where we were stationed for the entirety of recess. Anyway, it was interesting because one of the older kids was running D&D, probably the same edition I ended up playing eventually for my first game, and my twin brother, got into it. He played some, he thought it was awesome, and then eventually we made friends with this other kid, and we ended up going over to his house, and his mom ran Dungeons & Dragons for us, and it was fun. I mean, it's a great game. That edition we played, I don't remember much about the box or anything. I can't really identify what it was. It was the one we used some pre-generated characters like Darkblade. I think I remember that name. He was the fighter. There was a lot of there was a tower, a small town, and there was a quest involving a dragon. So, I mean, obviously that doesn't really narrow it down a whole lot, but, there you go. Maybe one of you listeners can identify that if I can't. So that was my first introduction to Dungeons & Dragons. And then we played an AD&D, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons campaign that my twin brother ran for several years there. And at least I think it was years. It might have been only a year or two. But it was but then eventually we kind of, by the time that wound down, 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons came out. So that gives us a bit of time of when this was. And 3rd edition is really what started my love of world building, because it was a game with a lot more rules than AD&D, and there was a lot more room to explore different ideas in the actual rules of the game. And I've always liked the rules, you know that as the listener of this show. I'm a very mechanical minded person when it comes to games. So I enjoyed this set of rules, and third edition is very complicated by the standards of a lot of editions of D&D. It's actually one of the most complex ones, but it was kind of an eye opener for me at the time. It really led me into other games eventually, because it led me to D20 Modern, which is a spin-off of third edition, which is, of course, modern and science fiction gaming in using the D20 rule set, same rules as third edition D&D. And even though D20 Modern isn't a very good game, that was the first game I really ran a lot of. I ran a bunch of one-shots, a few... And I didn't really have a campaign for D20 Modern. I mean, the closest I got was my first one-shot kind of turned into a campaign, and that involved first this big quest at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, with the nuclear contact zone, but then there were demons there. And then there were giant ogres that came from another dimension, and it got very silly. It was very much one of my games. The final round there ended with the characters fighting a demon in a spaceship that had just launched, and then they'd escape back to Earth. And then after that, we continued for a little while with the campaign. So that game was really fun, but it was also really broken. I made a lot of the rules myself, which when you're a teenager, that generally means the rules aren't so good. So I tried, and I created a lot of exploitable rules that the PCs luckily did exploit. It taught me a lot. My players really did kind of abuse what I gave them, which is cool, because that's what players are for, in some sense, when it comes to rules. They're going to break it. That's what they do. So expect your players to break the game a little bit, but that's okay, because this is a cooperative game. As long as they're all breaking the game, it becomes just more fun. Everyone's exploiting. And I think that's one thing to say about game balance, because I know when I started out, I had a wargaming background, even though it was a very fresh wargaming background by my standards today. And game balance is huge in wargaming, because wargaming is semi-competitive or totally competitive. You play two sides against each other. So that was my experience with that led to role-playing games, and so I've always been worried about the players being overpowered and stuff in the back of my head somewhere, but it's not that important. And as long as they're not overpowered compared to each other, as long as everyone's kind of on an even playing field with the other player characters, I think it's probably fine. There's some games where the feel is going to be messed up if the players are running amok, but I'm usually okay with that. That's because I tend to run superhero style games, and which I'll get to in a second, because I did start. After D20 Modern, the next real system I used was Mutants and Masterminds. And I used that for maybe 4 or 5 years as my primary system. I still really like it. And that's a D20-based superhero system from Green Ronin. I think I've definitely mentioned it before. And early on even. And that was the game I ran in my college years for the most part, at least for the first 3 years. Until I started running Rhesus Hack as a senior, and that's a game I bummed from S. John Ross, his free RPG document. I made some modifications. But Mutants and Masterminds was a really cool system because it's an Omni system. I liked D20 Modern at first because I thought, this is an Omni system. This is a game you can use to run any system, any setting, But I think D20 Modern doesn't come across that well as far as that, because the rules are just kind of boring. It's hard to play for a lot of people. And I think the core of Mutants and Masterminds is really a lot more fun to play. And that's why I like it better. It's not really a great Omni system. Again, it's originally designed to be a superhero game. But you can make about any character in the game, which means you could theoretically use it as an Omni system. It's just tricky to do that because it airs on the side of power and powerful characters and crazy events and lots of comic booky things, which are fun and I love, but they're not great for every setting. So when I say it was an Omni system, it felt like an Omni system to me, but it wasn't precisely that effective at it. So anyway, I did love that. I do love that game. I made a lot of characters. I was very active on the Atomic Think Tank back in the day as Dweller of the Deep. I would make, well, not very active, except on my own thread. I would post, because the Atomic Think Tank was the Green Ronin forum back then. and people would make, I think people still do this on the new Green Ronin forums, but people would make threads, where they'd put stats up for characters they'd either invented, like me, or which they converted, like most other people. They converted from comic books or whatever, where they say, oh, this character could do this. This is Daredevil, he can do this. This is Superman, he can do this. And put their stats up for Mutants and Masterminds. So that's kind of where I got really deep into Mutants and Masterminds. I did a lot of stuff with that, even when I wasn't playing it with other people. I ended up making a ton of settings for it, a ton of games that never actually got run, and I would really love to run, but it's hard to find people who don't want to run strictly superhero games or play strictly superhero games with Mutants and Masterminds, which is why I switched over to Rhesus Hack eventually. I also, in college, I played a bunch of other games, but mostly I ran Mutants and Masterminds and Rhesus Hack. I think the other games I played were mostly Nobilis, the diceless system, Spirit of the Century, the original Fate game, I think, and I think it's the original anyway. And then beyond college, I ended up doing some more Rhesus Hack stuff. Obviously, expanded that quite a bit. I've gotten into Savage Worlds, though I haven't actually run much of it. Actually, I don't know if I've ever run Savage Worlds. I mean, Blades in the Dark I ran, but I've run a bunch of systems because I'm a cipher a little bit. I'm experimenting. But I guess what it comes down to is I'm just talking here about the systems I've run, but I think it's more important to say, what kind of games have I run? And I think that's probably a story I'd rather discuss with Rob, because the style of game that a person runs is different from the systems. And this is all just kind of a prelude to that. So thanks for listening, everybody. You can find more of this show at mentalcellarpublications.com. We are hosted by Libsyn nowadays, and most of the episodes are now converted over, so whatever. You didn't need to know that. A little peek behind the curtain. But I'll probably have all the other ones converted over soon. They're all available still. But, whatever. Let me see. What else? Oh, yeah, yes. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at tniederwriter. You can follow Rob on Twitter. He's at StageHat. You can like us on Facebook. That's where we are. And I think that's everything. Oh, buy my books on Amazon. I've got new books coming out all the time, at least once or twice a month. I have a new book coming out that's under the name Tim Niederreiter. Thanks for listening.